What is going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. The next character to release is going to be JIAOQIU, and a lot of people have been saying that he's going to be mid. He's going to be not an improvement or a side grade to PELA at best. That PELA is an overall better debuffer that amplifies her damage a lot more than JIAOQIU does, and those people are just simply misinformed. So in this video, I'm going to set the record straight about JIAOQIU and PELA, or better yet, vulnerability debuff versus defense reduction. But before we begin, if you're in the market of buying stellar jades, check out our friends over at lootbar.gg, link in the description below. Without further ado, let's get right into the video. All right, so we're back here in my Acheron spreadsheet. We're not going to pay attention to anything up here. We're mainly going to focus in these two boxes right here, and then this little column down here. So to start off, the damage multiplier box is exactly what it is. It's going to show the damage multiplier from the changes that we do on these boxes right here. So right now it's at 0 because we have no extra damage, but let's say we add 10% defense reduction, is going to change, right? It's going to be shown by how much our damage is going to be multiplied by adding in extra stats. Essentially, it's going to be taking this base damage we have right here and then doing a little mathematical mumbo jumbo to spit out a damage multiplier. Because a lot more people are familiar with defense reduction or defense ignore rather than vulnerability, we're going to start with that. Defense multiplier is what I like to call a detractor multiplier, meaning that the multiplier itself, it's meant to limit the amount of damage you're doing, not meant to increase it. For instance, damage boost is a increasing multiplier or an additive multiplier that is meant to increase the amount of damage. Well, defense multiplier is the opposite. Defense multiplier, its purpose is to limit the amount of damage you're doing to a certain enemy based on their defense and their level and all that stuff. So to break it down, the defense multiplier takes the level of the attacker plus 20 and the level of the enemy plus 20. For most people, everybody's characters are level 80, and then for most enemies, they're all level 95. That's why you see 100 here and 115 here, because it's 80 plus 20 is 100 and 95 plus 20 is 115. So the defense multiplier takes those two numbers, throws them in this mathematical like mumbo jumbo that you see up here, and then spits out a multiplier, which in most cases is going to be around 0.47 or 0.5. A lot of people do 0.5. It's not really 0.5, it's more 0.47. And that really makes a difference because defense actually changes the damage multiplier a lot. So one of the misconceptions that people have with defense multiplier is that it is a straight up one-to-one damage increase. So if you have 20% defense reduction, 20% defense ignore, is going to be 20% damage increase. So defense doesn't actually work like that. It may work like that for certain numbers, but definitely not for all of them. And I would say for most, right? So if we add 20% defense reduction, and I want you to pay attention to this number right here in the damage multiplier, it's going to go up by about 12%. And the reason for this is that it's just not as straightforward as other multipliers like vulnerability, which we're going to talk about later, because it has all these other factors that contribute to it. So another thing is that I'm pretty sure you've heard it before, that the more defense reduction you have, the better the effect of defense reduction is. And that is very much true. So if we hyper focus again in the damage multiplier column, right now we're at 0 multiplier, let's add 10% defense reduction. Our multiplier is going to go up to 0.056, right? So that's 10% defense reduction adds 0.56 or 0.6 multiplier. If we were to double our defense reduction, boom, now we have almost 12. So almost the same, almost 6, not quite 6. But let's keep going. Let's add 30. Boom. Now we went from 11 or 12 to 19. That added 6 more or 7 more, depending on how you want to see it. So we started at 5, then 6, now it's adding 7. So let's keep going. Let's add 40% defense reduction. Right now it's at 19. Boom, 27. It added 0.8 now. So let's keep going. 50% defense reduction from 27 goes to 36. That is 9. So the more you have, the more you stack, the higher the impact of the defense reduction. So let's say for most people, PELA with resolution light cone is going to have 56% defense reduction. That's it, right? So 56% defense reduction is going to give you a multiplier of 0.42 or 0.43 if you were to round up, right? If you were to add 10% more defense reduction to this, we'll make it 66. It will go from 42 to 54, adding about 12 or 11.8 or 11.8 multiplier. And remember, in the beginning, we did a 10% damage increase, which if we go to 0, again, it's 0. And if we add 10, it's 5. So it went from adding 5 to adding 12, almost twice as much, which means this is compounding. This is exponential growth that the defense reduction has or defense ignore has. So at this point, at higher defense reductions is when defense starts to really take off, essentially. Like even at 50% is pretty good, but at higher than 50% defense reduction is when it really starts to compound like out of control. And then one more thing is that the defense multiplier can never be higher than 1 or like another way of saying it is that the enemy can never have less than 0 defense. So if we were to add 100% defense here, the multiplier goes to 1, right? And the multiplier is a 1-to-1 115% increase. But if we add 20 more, it'll stay at 1 because the max is 1. The max multiplier that you can have on defense is 1, which means the enemy has 0 defense or you're ignoring all of the defense. Now, let's talk about vulnerability. A lot of people are not really familiar with how vulnerability works, and it works pretty much differently than all the other multipliers because it doesn't have something working against it. I guess you can make the argument about damage bonus, but the way damage bonus works, it doesn't really mean that it's a 1-to-1 damage increase. Vulnerability to damage multiplier increase. What I mean by this is however amount you add, let's say you add 10% vulnerability, that's going to be a 10% damage increase. So if we had 10 to 100 is 110, and then look at the damage multiplier, it goes up by 0.1, which is 10%. The same thing can be said if we add it to 20, if we add it to 30, if we add it to 70, if we add it to 80, 90, like it doesn't matter what number we put in here, it's going to be a 1-to-1. The reason this is 1.5 is because it's adding the amount of multiplier added on to the multiplier, not the total of the multiplier. So the vulnerability multiplier here is 2.15, but the added damage multiplier is 1.15. But what I'm trying to say is that vulnerability has a very linear relationship with damage bonus or damage multiplier. So that's pretty much how vulnerability works. It's very simple. And it's also why characters like Topaz are very, very strong, because adding 50% vulnerability with her proof of debt is just a 50% damage increase. Whatever damage you were doing, you're going to do 50% more of that damage. So it's just that simple. And it's 100%, it's guaranteed. You can't miss proof of debt or whatever it's called. That's why Topaz for follow-up attackers is very, very strong, because of this multiplier right here. Now, which one of the two is better in which cases? So this is another conversation. So because vulnerability works the way it does, and it's a 1-to-1 conversion, and we already said that 10% defense reduction equals at 0.5 or 0.6, 0.05 or 0.06 damage multiplier, we already know that vulnerability will give us more damage. And it's going to be the same all the way up to about 90% or 88%, in which I have created for y'all a little chart. So this right here is the amount of percentage added. So this would be 10% vulnerability or 10% defense shred or defense ignore, and the amount of multiplier it gives you. So 10% vulnerability gives you 0.1 vulnerability and 0.06 defense ignore, and it goes all the way down. If you can notice that vulnerability goes by 10 every time, and defense multiplier starts compounding up until you get to this point. Once you get to 90% is when, or about 87% is when damage multiplier for defense shred actually becomes higher when you have more defense reduction. So all the way up to about 80%, I would say it's just better to just stack vulnerability if you can. That's why vulnerability is so rare. Not a lot of characters have it. To be fair, defense reduction also very rare. So according to this chart, you can see we're gonna go ahead and take a look at the vulnerability. Vulnerability is the orange. It's a linear path all the way up. Vulnerability doesn't have a cap until 250. So you can go up, like you can keep going all the way down to 250 with vulnerability. I don't think it's possible right now, but you can go all the way up to 250. Defense caps right here. So this is the max amount of defense you can actually have when it comes to the multiplier. You can have up to a max of 1.15 multiplier, which is right here. This is where it stops. If you can stack more than 100% vulnerability, then obviously stacking that will probably be better. But there is a better way, is that you can stack them together. You can run a vulnerability character and a defense reducing character, and then stacking, let's say 50% of each, which let's say Topaz and PELA would probably do the job, because PELA gives 56% defense reduction, and then Topaz gives you the 50% vulnerability multiplier. You're already going to have about over 100% multiplier increase. So you're pretty much going to double your damage just by adding those two in. Just adding 10% of each is almost as good as adding 20% individually. And then once it gets even crazier when you add 20% vulnerability, 20% defense ignore. It's better than just having 30% one, 30% of the other. When you get to 30, it's 50%. So it's better than adding like 60% of one versus 50% of the other. So it gets kind of crazy. So what I'm trying to say is that you mainly want to stack them up together in tandem. And if you can't do it in tandem, try to stack vulnerability first. You're less likely to hit 80% defense shred without Silver Wolf and PELA. There's no other character that can get you that high unless you have, like, I don't know, like Eidolons on Sparkle, Eidolons on Ruan Mei and stuff like that. You're not going to get all the way up to here. So If you can stack vulnerability first, then start stacking defense shred. Like, the point of this is just to say that stacking them together is probably the best way to go. Now, what does this mean for an Acheron team that can run PELA, JIAOQIU, or Silverwolf, or Gonaifen? So here I put a list of adding every single combination that I can have between the S1 of JIAOQIU, S5 Resolution plus the Sweat, which are the two icons that give you defense reduction and vulnerability. And this is all my results. At 0 defense and 0 vulnerability, you have 100% damage, which is 1 multiplier. JIAOQIU at E0 S1 gives you a 74% damage increase straight up, because we already know that is a 1-to-1 conversion. So 74% vulnerability is a 74% damage increase. Now, taking away his S1 and adding the resolution, which means you're stacking 16% defense, 50% vulnerability on ultimate damage. Mind you, this is for Acheron's ultimate damage. It's only going to drop by about 10%. Even though you reduce 24% vulnerability, you add a 16% defense ignore or defense reduction, and you get a total of 164 multiplier right here. Now, I did the opposite. I took PELA with JIAOQIU's light cone. It's 40% defense reduction and 24% vulnerability, and it came out less than just having JIAOQIU, because JIAOQIU's 50% vulnerability is just a baseline 50% damage increase just by that. PELA by herself with S5 resolution light cone is a 1.43, worse than all of them. Worse than all of them, actually, because it doesn't have any vulnerability. But then this is where it starts getting spicy. When you run PELA and JIAOQIU at the same time, you have 50% vulnerability, 50% defense ignore or defense reduction. This is very, very, very much doable. This is S0 JIAOQIU and then S5 PELA. For most people, you're going to need 2 Nihility characters anyway. And the multiplier goes to 200 and 2.4, which is 214% damage. This is really, really high. This is really strong, and it's very much doable. And not only that, because you have PELA and JIAOQIU, JIAOQIU helps stack Acheron faster than anybody else, especially when you have a lot of enemies on the field. Because every time they take a turn, if you have your JIAOQIU set up correctly, they will take a debuff, and then stacking Acheron will be much, much easier. Now, this is with S0 JIAOQIU. If you get the S1 for JIAOQIU and the S5 resolution light cones for PELA, you're looking to increase that damage by about 34% more. And remember, this is with JIAOQIU exponentially increasing the amount of stacks that your Acheron gets, so your ults are going to be firing off left and right. Pretty much every turn, your Acheron is going to be firing off an ult. Now, I took the liberty of adding in Gonaifen, so S0 JIAOQIU and S5 Gonaifen with resolution light cones. 78% vulnerability and 60% defense shred is worse than just adding in PELA. So just 56% defense is obviously, so adding in 28% vulnerability is not worth the drop in defense reduction that you have. Like I said, if you stack them up evenly or stack them up together, it's going to yield a better result. I went S5 JIAOQIU with Gonaifen with resolution plus sweat, 102% vulnerability with S1 JIAOQIU light cone, 16% defense reduction. The result is 2.21, which is almost the same as just running JIAOQIU and PELA. It's only a 7% damage difference. And this is just S0 JIAOQIU versus an S1 JIAOQIU. Again, suggesting that stacking them together is the way to go. S0 JIAOQIU with Silverwolf S5 resolution plus sweat, 50% vulnerability and 69% defense reduction or defense shred, 2.34, which is about 24% higher than just PELA. But remember, PELA applies to everybody. So this damage is actually going to be better for AoE scenarios. And then obviously Silverwolf only applies to one enemy. So this is only going to be for that one enemy. So if it is, for example, you're doing Apocalyptic Shadow, this Silverwolf and S0 JIAOQIU is probably going to end up being better. We add the S1 JIAOQIU and S5 resolution light cone to Silverwolf, 74% vulnerability and 69% defense shred. 2.76 is the highest multiplier, but this only applies to a single target because Silverwolf only hits a single target. And then last but not least, this is S0 Silverwolf and PELA. I think if we add the S1 JIAOQIU light cone to Silverwolf, we can bring this up to about 239, which is just the same as just having S0 JIAOQIU with S5 resolution plus sweat for her. So hopefully this video, I know it's a little bit confusing, a lot of numbers thrown at you, but hopefully this helped you understand that stacking vulnerability and defense shred together is probably better. But then if you have to choose between one or two, stacking vulnerability is probably going to end up being a much better result, unless you can stack all the way up to like 60, 70, 80. Once you get to those ranges, it's a little bit better to stack defense, but before then, stack vulnerability. Hopefully this video helped you understand a little bit more why JIAOQIU is so strong, so powerful. Like I said, just adding the JIAOQIU at E0 S1 just by himself adds 74% damage increase to your Acheron compared to the PELA S5, and also the JIAOQIU, where's JIAOQIU? 64% compared to 43%, which is about a 19% increase. And then also remember, 21% increase, I'm sorry. And also remember that JIAOQIU is going to help your Acheron stack way faster. So don't let the Doom posters get you. If you are in Acheron main, JIAOQIU is 100% an upgrade to PELA. Don't let anybody tell you differently. If you guys want, I'm going to leave this sheet in the description below, so check it out if you want it. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Did you get some value out of this video? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, guys. See ya.